tonight's being presented by Ronnie Slack, life member of the SCV, a member of the Longstreet Zoning Coffer Camp in Knoxville, retired from the U.S. Forest Service and lives in Harriman, Tennessee. So the program's on Jack Hinson, rebel sniper, or Jack Hinson, one-man army, or whatever you want to call him. I'll tell you more about it.
Actually, I guess I didn't speak plainly when he asked me. I am a retired forester, but I work for Bullwater Corporation. But anyway, I am a retired forester. I'd like to thank you for inviting me here this evening to share this story with you. It is a true story, and one that I think that everyone who is interested in Southern heritage should be aware of. Now, before I get started, let me make a couple of apologies. I've been having some issues with my throat, so I may have to do a good bit of that, so I hope you'll bear with me. My voice might crack occasionally, like I'm 13 years old and my voice was changing, but if that's the case, just assume I'm a little late in growing up. And if you see me moving around up here like I'm doing the Tennessee waltz or something, don't get concerned. It's just that my back doesn't like for me to stand in one position. Okay, if you were traveling over in the northwest part of Middle Tennessee, around Dover, and from Dover on northward into the area that is now called Land Between the Lakes, that goes on into western Kentucky, as you pass through a little place called Golden Pond, you might see that historical marker there. And on that historical marker you can read Civil War Sniper, Jack Hinson. And that's followed by just a couple of brief comments about this rather obscure, relatively unknown individual. And some of the information on the historical marker is somewhat in error. Now, I had never heard of Jack Hinson until I read this book, Jack Hinson's One-Man War. I think it is a fascinating story. I think it's much more interesting than fiction. If I had read a fiction story such as this, I might have said, well, now that is an interesting story, but it isn't likely something like that would have actually happened. After reading the book, which seemed to be very well researched over a period of about 15 years, I was left saying to myself, man, was that guy real? Just after I finished reading the book in the spring of 2009, Ed Butler, who I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Tennessee Division, Ed was giving a presentation up at Wartburg one Saturday, and I drove up to hear Ed. I knew Ed was from western Kentucky, near where many of the events of this book took place. So I asked Ed if he was familiar with Jack Hinson. Ed said, oh yes, I've heard about Jack Hinson all of my life. So, in the area where it happened, at least some people are still aware of the Jack Hinson story. Most of us have not been. This book is written by Tom C. McKinney. Tom McKinney is a retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Marine Corps. He served as an infantry officer and paratrooper in Korea and Vietnam, and retired from the military due to an injury he received in Vietnam. Tom McKinney is a graduate of the University of Kentucky and the University of North Carolina. He is a student of military history. He's contributed articles to magazines such as American Legion, Military, Leatherneck, and Guidepost. He's an advocate for Veterans Affairs. He's appeared on numerous radio programs and TV shows such as the CBS Morning News, the Today Show, and Fox News Channel. Now, I went through all that just to show that Tom McKinney is a credible author. He wasn't someone who just tried to come up with an interesting story. Tom McKinney was only interested in writing the true story of Jack Hinson. The foundational facts of his book are known and authenticated, recovered in exhaustive research of the records of the National Archives, the records of the Tennessee and Kentucky State Archives, records at Fort Donelson, collections of city, county, and university libraries, collections of historical societies, 19th century newspaper accounts, and interviews with descendants of Jack Hinson. Now, to flesh out his book, around the facts, McKinney did write about things that might have been happening at particular times. For example, in the book, he might say Jack was gathering wood to build a fire, cooking his supper, leaning back against a tree, smoking his pipe, what he might have been thinking at particular times, and so on. But I will confine my presentation to parts of the story that McKinney was able to pretty much document. Jack Hinson's family tried to suppress his story after the war between the states, or the war for Southern independence, out of fear of retaliation from the occupying Union Army. So Jack Hinson's story remained somewhat hidden and obscure for many years. Let me read just a brief excerpt. Despite the numbers of men sent to kill him, Hinson evaded all capture, and like his footsteps through the Kentucky and Tennessee underbrush, his story has been shrouded in silence until now. The result of 15 years of research, this remarkable biography presents the never-before-told story of Jack Hinson, his savage one-man war, and the brutal cost of vengeance. I gave this presentation to the Longstreet Zollicoffer camp of the SCV in October 2009. Lynn Hammond, the first lieutenant commander of the camp, had placed a notice in the announcement section of the Knoxville News Sentinel stating that Jack Hinson's private war was to be presented at the SCV meeting. Lynn also put his phone number in that announcement. The next day, a Ms. Bridgewater, a local lady, called Lynn and said Jack Hinson was my great-great-uncle, and I am so glad that his story is finally being told. Ms. Bridgewater was 85 years old at that time. Now, as I said earlier, the events of this book took place over in the area that is now called Land Between the Lakes. I have here a very rough drawing of a map of that area. In case someone may not be familiar with the geography of that area, let me briefly set it up. Of course, the Tennessee River flows southward from Knoxville down through Chattanooga here, on down into North Alabama. Then it turns westward, flows over to the northwest corner of Alabama, and then the Tennessee River turns just about due north and flows through Tennessee again. We'll pick it up here in the north part of that area of Tennessee. It flows on into western Kentucky, empties into the Ohio River at Paducah, Kentucky, and now the Kentucky Lake is backed up on the Tennessee River in that area. Just a few miles east of there is the Cumberland River, which flows westward from Nashville over to Dover. Then at Dover, the Cumberland River turns northward, meanders through western Kentucky, empties into the Ohio River at Smithland, Kentucky, and now Lake Barkley is backed up on the Cumberland River. So now we call the area between Lake Barkley and the Kentucky Lake Land Between the Lakes. Of course, in the 1860s, there were no there were no lakes backed up on those rivers, and this area in here was called Tween the Rivers by the local inhabitants. It was an area about 60 miles long from north to south and averaged 10 to 15 miles between the two rivers. The people who lived between the rivers were somewhat isolated by the rivers because there were no bridges across the rivers in that area at that time, and just a very few river ferries. The people who lived between the rivers were mostly of Scottish ancestry. They were hard-working people, self-sufficient, self-reliant, fiercely independent, somewhat clannish, suspicious of outsiders. They were a God-fearing people, and as the author of the book stated, they didn't fear anybody but God. He said, in effect, they were mountaineers without any mountains. There are some pretty good hills in that area, but no mountains. But perhaps the isolation caused by the rivers had produced a culture somewhat similar that isolation caused by mountains has sometimes produced. Now, Jack Hinson, the subject of our story, was born in 1807. There's a likeness of him on the board. The physical description we have of Jack Hinson comes from Major Charles Anderson, who served as an adjutant to General Nathan Bedford Forrest during the war. And we'll find out later how Major Anderson came to know Jack Hinson. But Major Anderson described Jack Hinson as being a relatively short man. Even for that time period, he was about 5 feet 5 inches tall. He had unusually long and muscular arms. He was a quiet man who spoke sparingly. He had clear gray eyes, compressed lips, and massive jaws. Major Anderson offered his opinion that Jack Hinson's natural appearance clearly indicated that under no circumstances was he a man to be trifled with. He was small, but he was wound up tight. Now, Jack Hinson was a man of means. He was a prosperous farmer. He bought and sold land, and he had financial interest in some of the local iron furnaces. Jack Hinson's farm finally grew to be about 1,200 acres. It was located 3 miles southwest of Dover in Stewart County. His farm was called Bubbling Springs due to a large spring located on the property. Jack and his wife Elizabeth had 12 children, and Jack owned 50 slaves. They had a good life there at Bubbling Springs, although they were somewhat isolated. They raised abundant farm crops. They had several different types of fruit orchards on their property. They raised cash crops, primarily of corn and tobacco, that they would ship downriver to markets. Of course, they raised other things you would expect on a farm for their own use, such as cattle, horses, hogs. And wild game was still plentiful in the area. When the winds of war started blowing, Jack Hinson said he didn't want anything to do with it. He could see no reason to become involved, and he urged his family to stay out of it. Now, some might say, well, he was a slaveholder, so surely he must have been a Confederate sympathizer, but that was not a defining issue. As one example, in my home county of McMinn County, Tennessee, which was just about evenly divided between Union and Confederate sympathizers, some of the strongest, most ardent Unionists in McMinn County were also slaveholders. Another example, when the Union Army under General Burnside occupied Knoxville and Fort Sanders in September of 1863, when they wanted a large trench dug around Fort Sanders, which was dug 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide, it was dug by slaves, owned by Union sympathizers around Knoxville. And there's many examples such as that. On May the 7th, 1861, the Tennessee legislature passed a resolution in favor of military support for the seceding states, and Governor Isham Harris issued a call for volunteers to defend the South. Southern patriotism ran quite high in that area, so Confederate volunteer companies began springing up rather quickly. Jack Hinson opposed secession. He held quietly to his conviction and continued to urge his sons to stay out of the coming war. However, one of his sons, named William, did go ahead and join Company E of the 14th Tennessee Confederate Infantry Regiment. William ended up being sent to Virginia and spent most of the war in Virginia. Jack Hinson and the rest of his family held to a position of neutrality and were able to carry on with life pretty much as normal at Bubbling Springs for the remainder of 1861. By early 1862, the Union Army under General Grant was plundering its way over that part of Tennessee, and in February of 1862, during the days of the Battle of Fort Donelson, General Grant's army camped on part of Jack Hinson's property. The author of the book goes into the Battle of Fort Donelson in some detail. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do that, except to say the Confederates pretty much got the best of the fighting, but then they surrendered the fort to the Union Army. We'd have to go into some detail to explain how that came about. But be that as it may, during the days of that battle, Jack Hinson would make his way about the area, trying to keep up with what was going on, probably more concerned with how all that activity was going to affect his property than anything else. He would make his way back and forth between the two armies. He was friendly and cooperative with both armies, but from reading the book, I believe his attitude must have been similar to that of Jimmy Stewart's character in that old movie Shenandoah. If I remember correctly, that character considered both armies to be a bunch of fools. Jack Hinson had direct contact with General Grant during that time, and at one point, General Grant was a guest in Jack Hinson's home. After the Confederates surrendered Fort Donelson to the Union Army, the Confederate Army pretty much pulled out of that part of Tennessee, and from that point forward, it was essentially under Union control. However, there were some small bands of Confederate partisan guerrillas that began to organize to harass and oppose the Yankee invaders as best they could. Jack Hinson and his family continued to hold to a position of neutrality and to carry on with life as normally as possible. The Union Army wasted no time in beginning to punish local citizens whom they suspected of having given any aid to the Confederates or even of having Confederate sympathies. With son William, a Confederate soldier in Virginia, the Hinson family was under suspicion. On the day that Fort Donelson was surrendered, two more of Jack's sons, George and John, were arrested by Union soldiers and charged with being spies. They were not spies, as they were complying with their father's wishes to stay out of the war. George and John were held for a month by the Union Army, but then released because there was nothing to indicate that they were spies. And it was also thought that the fact that Jack had been friendly and cooperative with General Grant was favorable toward George and John being released. Jack's oldest son, named Robert, who was already married with a family and living out on his own, Robert also had stayed out of the war until now. The war had been going on about 10 months by this time, and Robert had stayed out of it. But with the harassment and punishment that was being inflicted upon local citizens, Robert felt like he had to do something. So Robert joined one of the local Confederate guerrilla bands. Jack Hinson and the rest of the family continued to hold to a position of neutrality. Now this is like February of 1862. Now let's move on to the summer of 1862. Jack Hinson and his family still holding to a position of neutrality. But in the summer of 1862, Jack Hinson decided to free his slaves. Now this was a few months before Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and by the way, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to the state of Tennessee anyway, but the Union Army had a habit of confiscating slaves and pressing them into whatever service they needed them for. Jack Hinson hoped that if his slaves became free persons, there would be less excuse for that to happen. So he gave his slaves their freedom. He told them he would like for them to stay and work for him, but they were free to leave if they wished. They all said that they wanted to stay. Okay, now let's move on to late 1862. By late 1862, these Confederate guerrilla bands were given the Yankees' fits. By using hit and run tactics, they would attack Union patrols, tear down telegraph lines, attack the parties sent out to repair the lines, attack Union supply wagons, just anything to harass the Yankees. They would appear seemingly out of nowhere, hit quickly and hard, then just as quickly they would disappear into the hills, and the Union Army could not find them. So the Department of Missouri, which was over the Union Army in that area, changed its policy towards suspected spies, or bushwhackers, as they call these Confederate guerrilla bands, to be take no prisoners. no prisoners of suspected spies or bushwhackers were to be brought in. They were to be dealt with on the spot. Also, in late autumn of 1862, Jack Hinson and his family were still trying to cling to a position of neutrality. George and John, the two boys who had been arrested and released several months earlier, they still had not caught the war fever and were continuing to abide by their father's wishes to stay out of the war. But one day, as they customarily did in the fall of the year, they went deer hunting. They were hunting in the woods northwest of their home. There they encountered a Union patrol of the 5th Iowa Cavalry. George and John were arrested and accused of bushwhacking. Now, with the policy that was then in place, the mere suspicion of bushwhacking was sufficient justification for execution. No such prisoners were to be brought in. George was 22 years old. John was 17. George and John were taken to the north side of the road that ran from Dover over to Paris Landing, tied to a tree, and shot. Now, what happened next seems too horrible to believe, but the author of the book said he verified the account from different and independent sources, and it did happen. The Yankee patrol leader, with his saber, he severed the heads of George and John from their bodies. They then took the bodies to Dover, put them on display as a warning to Confederate sympathizers. They then took the heads of George and John to Jack's home. A sergeant carried them in a burlap sack. When they got to Jack's home, the sergeant placed the heads of George and John on the front yard gate post. The lieutenant went to the door and demanded to see Jack. He said these men were caught bushwhacking. They were arrested and executed. So now you have Jack Hinson, an opponent of secession, an opponent of the war. He had been friendly and cooperative with General Grant and had tried his best to stay out of what he considered to be an unnecessary war. But suddenly things were now different. 2 of his sons had been murdered. Jack Hinson was now 57 years old. He was of Scottish ancestry, and he strongly believed in a law of vengeance. To Jack Hinson, it had become a personal matter. Jack began to formulate a plan to take the vengeance that he considered necessary. He knew he would have to take his time. He couldn't just come out with guns blazing. He wouldn't last long enough to carry out his plan. Jack Hinson had plenty of small caliber Kentucky rifles in his home, but for what he had in mind, he decided that he wanted a special weapon. So he decided that he wanted a custom-made 50 caliber rifle designed for long-range accuracy. He wanted a large caliber weapon, which he figured would inflict a fatal wound almost anywhere above the thighs. He was able to order the cap lock mechanism for his rifle. Then he contracted with a local gunsmith to fashion the barrel and the stock and to complete the final product. He told the gunsmith that he wanted his rifle to be able to sustain the chamber pressure of at least 100 grains of black powder. Jack then began securing the supplies he would need. He figured he shouldn't be seen purchasing large amounts of black powder or percussion caps, so he began to acquire those things a little at a time from as many different sources as possible to hold down suspicion. Jack began observing Union patrols. Concealed in the forest or the underbrush, he would observe Union patrols, their routes, their schedules, their sizes, their armaments. He spent a lot of time scouting out favorable firing positions. He found vantage points to cover roads and trails and both rivers. He especially considered heavily wooded, hilly terrain into which he could easily disappear. He figured he could operate on either river, but the bluffs on the Tennessee River were higher in that part of Tennessee and Kentucky and presented more favorable firing positions. Now keep in mind that George and John were murdered in the fall of 1862. By February of 1863, Jack Hinson was now referring to the Union Army as the enemy and to the Confederates as our forces. The Union Army had made a convinced Confederate out of Jack Hinson. Also, by February of 1863, Jack Hinson's rifle was now ready. It weighed 18 pounds. It had a heavy octagonal barrel, 41 inches long, inch and a half outside diameter, of course bored to .50 caliber. It had a maple stock. Of course, it was too heavy for offhand firing and needed a rest for the rifle barrel for long distance accuracy. The rifle had no fancy decorations on it whatsoever. It had no shiny surfaces that might reflect sunlight to give away Jack's location. It was made strictly for business. The only shiny thing on it was a tiny spot of silver on the front sight to aid when sighting in poor lighting conditions. The gunsmith also made a bullet mold to make conical-shaped mini balls to match the rifle's bore. Jack Hinson's rifle is still in existence today. There's a photo of the author of the book holding Jack's rifle. I'll tell you where it's presently located just a little later. Now, with suspicion around Jack Hinson and his family growing steadily stronger, Jack then did a somewhat surprising thing which he hoped would minimize that suspicion, at least temporarily. On February the 21st, 1863, Jack Hinson went to Fort Donelson and took the oath of allegiance to the United States. There was a severe penalty for violating that oath, but avenging the murders of his two sons was paramount to Jack Hinson. Jack tried to keep normal activities going on at Bubbling Springs as best he could, but he began to spend a lot of time out in very remote areas test firing and practicing with his new rifle. He tested how it performed under different circumstances. He took note of the drop of the bullet at different distances. He even tried to calculate how crosswinds of various velocities might affect the trajectory of the bullet. He determined what adjustments were needed when firing downward from river bluffs or firing upward from river bottoms. He practiced firing and reloading as quickly as possible. He practiced with his new rifle until he felt that he was proficient with it. He figured that most of the time he would only get one shot, and he wanted that shot to be effective. Okay, again, remember, George and John were murdered in the fall of 1862. Let's move on now to April of 1863, a few months since George and John were murdered. But one day in April of 1863, Jack selected a position on a steep hill above a road that was a Union patrol route. He had observed them on it many times, so he knew they would be coming. The road had steep banks on the upper side, so he knew they could not pursue him quickly. From behind a log, which he used as a rest for his rifle barrel, Jack took careful aim, he fired, and he took out that lieutenant that had come to his door, essentially bragging about what they had done to his sons. As soon as he was sure that his aim had been true and the bullet had done its job, he quickly disappeared into the hills. A few weeks later, from a similar but different location, Jack again took careful aim. This time he took out that sergeant who had placed the heads of George and John on the front yard gate post. Again, as soon as he was sure that his aim had been true, he quickly disappeared into the forest. Then Jack wondered if perhaps he should now just let it go. He had gotten the two that he wanted most, so he decided that yes, if the Yankees would now leave he and his family alone, he would not continue his one-man war. He would just let it go. And he did for the remainder of 1863. He was a special object of suspicion by this time, but he tried to appear just as a harmless old man going about his normal activities. Now, Jack's son Robert, who had been operating with one of the local Confederate guerrilla bands, Robert seemed to be a natural-born leader. He seemed to have natural instincts for military cavalry tactics, so Robert had become the leader of his band of guerrillas, and they were harassing the Yankees at every turn. However, on September the 18th, 1863, Robert was killed in a skirmish with the Yankees. Jack grieved over Robert's death, as you would expect a father to do, but he said this was different. Robert was participating in the war. George and John were not. So Jack did not plan any retaliation for Robert's death. He had let it go. Okay, now let's move on to January of 1864. Jack Hinson and what was left of his family, carrying on with life as best they could under the circumstances. As far as Jack was concerned, his vendetta against the Yankees was over. He had let it go. But in January of 1864, the Union authorities at Fort Donelson decided that there was just too much suspicion around that Hinson family, and the whole family should be arrested. Under Union occupation policies, if the Hinson family was arrested, of course, their property would be confiscated. The whole family could be subject to banishment from the area, or imprisonment, or even execution. Most likely, Jack would have been executed had the family been arrested at that time. But somehow, and it isn't known for sure how, perhaps through loose talk by Union soldiers at Dover, but some of Jack's friends who lived at Dover got wind of what was about to happen, and they hurried to warn Jack. Jack decided that he and his family must flee immediately, even though it was a cold winter night and it was snowing heavily. They gathered some things together very quickly and they left Bubbling Springs. Jack riding his mare, Elizabeth and the children riding in a large sled, pulled by 2 mules, driven by 2 of the former slaves. 2 of Jack's daughters were ill with the measles at the time. Staying off the roads, they made their way through the snowstorm to Wynn's Ferry on the Tennessee River. It would have been down in this area. Even though it was a cold, snowy night, Elizabeth and the children and the 2 former slaves were able to make their way across the river by the ferry to the west side. Jack decided not to cross the river with them because he figured that if he were caught, it would be better for his family if they were not with him. So Elizabeth and the children made their way over into Henry County to a place called Sulphur Wells, where they had some relatives. Sulphur Wells was a somewhat remote area, somewhat sparsely populated, and the Union Army had not given it too much notice, so they hoped that they would be safe there. The very next day, after they fled their home, Union troops arrived at Bubbling Springs, and when they could not find Jack or his family, and could get no information from the former slaves, even after intense interrogation, they burned the Hinson home. They intended to burn the barns also, but the former slaves finally convinced the soldiers that without those barns and the contents, that they could no longer continue to live there, and they would all have to come to Fort Donelson for refuge. Those Yankee soldiers did not want them coming to Fort Donelson, so they relented and spared the barns. In the meantime, Jack had made his way to a small cave on the bluff of the Tennessee River, several miles southwest of Bubbling Springs. It was way down in this area. It was a cave that Jack was familiar with because he and his sons He and his sons had used it as a hunting camp in previous years. The cave had an inconspicuous opening near the top of the bluff, but then opened up enough inside that Jack could live in it. It didn't take long for what had happened at Bubbling Springs to spread throughout the countryside. Some days later, Jack made contact with a friend of his who lived not too far from his cave. His friend informed Jack that he had heard that the Hinson home had been burned and that Jack and his family were now wanted fugitives. This was a war that Jack had not wanted in the first place, and now he and his family were branded as outlaws. Jack decided if war was what they wanted, war it would be. He would take down as many of the invaders of his homeland as he could. Now, Union boats traveling south on the Tennessee River in that area, of course, were going upstream. And many times they were making very slow progress against the current, especially in some areas. Jack made his first kill of a Union soldier on one of the river boats when he fired from the bluff near his cave. Then he began to do that on a frequent and regular basis from different locations up and down the east side of the Tennessee River in that part of Tennessee and on up into Kentucky. He targeted mainly officers if he could identify them from the distance at which he was firing. Many times he would just make one kill on an individual boat and then let it pass. Occasionally he would make more than one kill on an individual boat. There would be return fire from the river boats, but it was harmless because they couldn't tell where Jack's fire came from, so they would just fire blindly toward the bluff. Most of the time, Jack operated from the river bluffs, but occasionally he would drop down into the river bottom and, concealed in a cane brake or willow thicket or some other cover, he would make a kill on one of the river boats and then quickly fade into the underbrush. Jack justified to himself making these kills on the river boats because these boats were carrying soldiers and supplies to continue a war that Jack had not wanted and a war that had already caused he and his family much grief. He later said that he had gotten satisfaction from taking the life of that lieutenant and sergeant who were directly responsible for the murders of George and John, but he said he took no pleasure in making these kills on the riverboats. He realized that he was taking the lives of men who had families and loved ones too. But he considered that this war had been forced upon him, and now he must continue it. He just wished that these blue-clad soldiers would go on back home and leave his homeland alone. He began using a small punch and a hammer to make little dents or little rings like on his rifle barrel to record his kills. He later began to make notches on the rifle barrel for the same purpose. Those marks are still evident on the rifle barrel today. You can see a few of them there. The Union Army knew by now that it was Jack Hinson doing this sniping from the river bluffs, and they sent troops out time after time to get him. But Jack knew these forests and hills intimately, and he had no trouble staying away from the Yankee soldiers. They even put a price on his head, hoping that a local person would kill Jack for the reward, or at least supply information so the Union soldiers could get him. Jack occasionally would run into a local citizen as he made his way about the area, up and down the river, but no one ever betrayed Jack to the Yankees. Jack continued this sniping activity on a frequent and regular basis throughout the year of 1864. One of Jack's younger sons, named Joseph, who is now living with the family over in Sulphur, Wales, in September of 1864, Joseph had his 16th birthday. Joseph decided that it was time that he joined the Confederate Army. He did so. Joseph was sent to Virginia. He got there just about in time to go through that long, cold, hard, hungry winter at Petersburg. In the fall of 1864, Jack Hinson decided to cross over to the west bank of the Tennessee River and to operate from that side. He did so and then continued his sniping activities in Benton and Henry counties, Tennessee, and on up into Marshall and Callaway counties in Kentucky. It was during that time that he came into contact with General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was making a raid against Union supply lines up in that area. Since Jack knew the terrain so well, for a brief time in the fall of 1864, he served as a guide and a scout for General Forrest. And it was during that time that Jack came into contact and got to know Major Charles Anderson. In later years, Major Anderson said that one day when Jack Hinson was with them during the war, that he asked Jack about the notorious one-man war he was waging and the growing price that was on his head. He said, Jack replied, "They murdered my boys, and they may yet kill me. But the marks on the barrel of my gun will show that I am way ahead in the game now, and I'm not done yet." Jack continued his sniping activities through the fall of 1864 and the winter of 1865. He ended the war with 36 little dents, or circles, made on his rifle barrel with a punch, and many more notches. Now, the author of the book says, of course, there is no way to prove it for sure, but he says from examining Jack's rifle and any other information he could get, that he believes that it may be likely that Jack Hinson may have killed over 100 Union soldiers. A tenacious and elusive figure, Hinson likely killed more than 100 Union soldiers, recording the confirmed deaths on the barrel of his rifle with precision. But by the end of the war, Jack Hinson had lost much. Of course, he lost his home and some other possessions, but those things were insignificant compared to his real losses, as we consider those. Okay, again remember, George and John were murdered in the fall of 1862. Robert was killed in a skirmish with the Yankees in September of 1863. In January of 1864, the two daughters who were ill with the measles the night they had to flee their home, they both died just a few days later from the combined effects of the measles and exposure to the very harsh weather for many hours during their flight from home. Son William, who had spent most of the war in Virginia, William was wounded in the left leg on January the 13th, 1865. William died the next day after having a leg amputation. Young Joseph, who entered the war late, Joseph managed to finish the war. He was at the surrender at Appomattox. Joseph was able to make it home, but he died very shortly afterward, presumably due to the stresses of the war that he endured during that very hard winter at Petersburg. So Jack lost 7 of his 12 children, either directly or indirectly to the war. Jack stayed in his cave for some time after the war because he knew he was a fugitive with a price on his head. When he did come out of his cave, he tried to maintain a low profile. When he retrieved his family from Sulphur, Wales, he moved them to a backcountry area called White Oak Creek Valley, and they tried to live a quiet life there. Jack's former slaves remained at Bubbling Springs, and for whatever reason, I think perhaps out of affection or respect for Jack, they called their community Hinson Town. In the confusion after the war, Jack seemed to fall through the cracks for some time. But in June of 1873, a process was set in motion to bring Jack Hinson before a Reconstruction military tribunal and to execute him for his wartime activities. Jack's supporters were able to delay that process, and Jack died peacefully at home 13 months later at the age of 67. 67 wasn't a particularly young age for someone to die at that time, but it was also thought that Jack living out of doors in all types of weather for over a year, along with the other stresses and anxieties of the war, and the threat of execution which hung over his head until he did die, all of those things may have served to shorten Jack's life somewhat. But at least he escaped the Yankee noose. 5 children did survive Jack and his wife Elizabeth, and the author of the book traces their lineage on down through the years. Now Jack's rifle. After the war, he gave his rifle to his good friend, General Nathan Bedford Forrest. At some point in time, General Forrest gave the rifle to his wartime adjutant, Major Charles Anderson. Major Anderson had no children, so before he died, he gave the rifle to his brother-in-law, William Love. William Love passed the rifle down to his daughter, Frances Black. Frances Black passed Jack's rifle down to her daughter, Eugenie McFarland, with written instructions that it was to go to her grandson, Benny. Benny is now Judge Ben Hall McFarland of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and Judge McFarland now has Jack Hinson's rifle in his possession. I have never seen it, but I would sure like to. I understand that it is going to be on display at the Relic Show in Pigeon Forge on August the 25th and 26th, I believe. I'm not sure whether I can get there or not. Okay, one more comment and I'll be finished. I mentioned at the beginning that Ms. Bridgewater had called Lynn Hammond and said that Jack Hinson was her great-great-uncle. I called Miss Bridgewater and had a nice little conversation with her. But she said with the passing of the years that many of the details had faded from her memory. But she said when she was a little girl, as they would sit around the fire, sometimes her father and uncles would talk about Uncle Jack. She said, now I just mainly remember that Uncle Jack had a special rifle and he shot Yanks from the river bus. Okay, so there you have it. Jack Hinson. Was Jack Hinson a criminal, a patriot, a terrorist, a freedom fighter, a hero? Ms. Bridgewater was aware that the federal government considered her Uncle Jack to be a criminal. I assured her that I consider Jack Hinson to have been a hero. Thank you very much for your attention.